Hello everyone, today we talk about the Longobard Kingdom. As you know, we have already dedicated quite a number of videos to Longobard history, and I realized that actually one of the very first ones was about something like public order in Longobard, Italy, something like that, and one of the users made me realize that I had not recorded the audio, or at least something had gone wrong. It was one of the first times I tried, so although this video is not going to be exactly its own repetition, but we will look at that partially as well, so that can be useful. And I believe that this is a topic we'll have also to come back on many times, because it's perhaps one of the most underestimated and overlooked topics in early medieval Europe. And starting to talk about the Longobards now out of the blue, especially about the kingdom, because here it's going to be their history since roughly, the time that they were already settled into Italy. Now it can be complicated but without a background, but there is the Longobard history playlist that can help you a bit. We will try, however, to be a bit introductory as well. So as you know, Italy had been invaded traditionally in 568. That's kind of the only date that we have. There is some debate whether other parts of the Longobard people had migrated before and afterwards than the main block, but it seems that effectively in 568 there is the migration with a larger bulk of the people from the Danubian Valley, the Middle Danube more precisely, into chiefly northern Italy, but then the Longobards swept immediately throughout the whole peninsula, right? So these people, we talk about them normally and rightfully, in my opinion, as Germanic people. There is some debate relatively to other, consistent ethnic groups that made up the Longobards at the time, especially of the invasion of Italy, given that it was normal, actually had been normal both for the Huns, for the Goths, etc. Previously, that when you're on the move, you get lots of people together with you because they want to share eventually the loot, the conquest, etc. So it was a kind of effectively a multi-ethnic group, but it was German dominant. There's been a lot of debate relatively to this, because I believe historiography has gone for certain reasons that now we will not cover, but a bit too far in saying, basically it doesn't even matter what kind of ethnicity they were, because they were all completely mixed. This is not really fair, in my opinion, as an historical assessment, because first of all, we don't really know, right? There is no actual macroscopical structural evidence to tell this population had effectively this type of ethnicity. But all the historical sources that define these populations called the Longobards as Germans. There are many similarities of these peoples that were known through classical sources as Germans. There is a huge debate even in this sense to understand whether the terms like Celts or German weren't really a Greek or Roman ethnographic invention, and whether they really felt to belong to that. I think we have gone a bit. These are fair points, actually. They're very interesting, fascinating, but perhaps we have gone too far. Even for other ethnic groups like the Goths, etc., for which it is stressed that there was probably realistically a much higher ethnic mix compared to these other populations, especially of the Western Germans. But if you look at what we know, very in essential about their migration route, etc., yeah, you can say we don't know a lot of things, and it's definitely fair to say that they incorporated lots of other populations, but that sometimes this Germanic origin is just a pure myth, like saying, they at a certain point they decided to invent the history of their origins, because there are historians, even of a certain leverage, that they kind of express themselves in these terms, like, it's not supported by evidence, especially in the case of the Longobards. This really doesn't explain how, ethnically composed they were at the moment, the second half of the 6th century, but, for instance, their traditions are strikingly, accurate in terms of what they can confirm about the very origin of the people, sometime around the 1st century BC, as the Romans that invading Germany crushed them at one point already called them Tacitus says that pretty explicitly as Longobards, and this is the ethnonym that they maintain now for half of a millennium. So, and also consider that, yeah, the migration era was a great melting pot in many ways, but at the same time, there were even a relatively few people in general. I mean, out there in the so-called Barbaricum in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, etc. It's not that these groups, really mixed with an enormous amount of other ethnicities that were all wandering around and fluid. This relative kinetic energy of that system was pretty low, right? And it was concentrated now in these groups and confederations that stuck together, definitely were reinforced by other foreign elements. And in the case of the Longobards, it's perfectly fair to assess, especially because of their face of Reitervolk, their zootechnic capabilities. It seems that the Longobards especially, even though we don't have the perfect proof of this, but it's pretty obvious that were perhaps the Germanic people that stayed longest under Hunnic rule into Central Europe, even after the death of Attila and under his son. And therefore they're very and massively, and you can definitely bet on this, massively influenced in cultural terms by the steppes. If you look at the typical and sometimes even stereotypical picture of the Longobard warrior, the one with armor and all, that was something ultra elitary in nature, you see that they're identical to the aristocratic elite that you can find everywhere from the Pannonian Plain to the Bering Strait, because that's how the steppes has ever fought and had that kind of armor, of weaponry, and all this stuff. And that's we know that we have Longobard tombs that show us horse archers. These were guys that were very good horsemen. They had definitely a great equestrian tradition. Their model of manhood and warriorhood, if you want, it was in fact the mounted horseman. That is something that these peoples will basically remember very long after they even settled down and they had stopped to live in the semi-nomadic fashion they were used to now, as long as they remain outside the Roman borders. There is to say that the Longobards were also some of the least Romanized peoples in absolute terms, and they were kind of arriving at the very end of the migration era, right? We are in 568. Most of the other, especially the Germanic populations, had more or less already settled down, and the Longobards, by the way, were in contact with populations, as we've seen, like the Huns, eventually as the Avars, that had settled now in the Carpathian Basin, and were slowly, beginning. There were actually, there's this myth that the Avars kind of pushed away the Longobards. There is actually no proof of this. Time the Longobards leave the Pannonian Basin, they do it in accordance with the Avars, that are, however, not the mighty power that will become in a few decades when they will unite and start harassing even the Constantinople itself. But yeah, they were surely not very easy neighbors, and they preferred, but the main reason why the Longobards migrated into Italy is that Italy was without defense, right? And the reason we can say further, though, and this is also not really proved, that the Longobards migrating into Byzantine Italy through the same pacts of accord that were standardly accorded to the Federati, or Summaco, if you prefer, of the Roman Empire, to settle into the Po Valley and to be effectively what they had already been up to that point. It was, in fact, Roman allies, right? Byzantine allies at that point. This story, we can't cover all that history of the previous century before the migration, because that would be particularly interesting. Suffices to say now that as long as they arrive into Italy, they have they're actually a very strong people. They are, by the way, not just one of the largest, let's say, confederation is even kind of wrong, but say group more generically of peoples, because the confederation is you don't find a real confederation into the Longobards. It's not like several tribes together at this point. At this point, they really pretty standardly feel themselves as kind of Longobards. They have all the various clans, of course. There are other Germanic elements, but they conceive themselves as a people, and they will kind of consider doing so. And this is particularly important also relatively to their ethnonym, because it was quite different from, for example, the one of the Franks or the Alemanni, that they wanted to stress, for example, their confederative nature, like lots of tribes that joined together this bond, where the various tribes that kept maintaining other names and other identities kind of cooperated together. The Longobards were really the Longobards. I mean, they were the same ethnic nucleus that had started their day back when they migrated, according to legend, from Scandinavia, which is quite fair, possible by the way, into northern Germany and settled on the lower Elbe, sharing, by the way, lots in common with the Saxons. Incredibly now, one of our users was making me notice that some genetic data has been found in Longobard graves into Italy, strikingly similar to some find into England, actually. So that may say, in fact, part of the Longobards actually remained where they were. They didn't all migrate through the Elbe Valley and reaching Central Europe. They basically stayed there and were absorbed by the Saxon furthermore. So that is a note of color that can make you understand. But the Longobards were really the people, and they had, in this sense, not really kind of a exclusivistic mindset of their ethnicity. Actually, we have pretty old proof that Longobards were pretty open. They were pretty inclusive. They definitely because they were small people in the beginning, so they understood if they wanted to survive into that mess that the migration era had been, they had to integrate lots of populations. But they were really, I mean, their culture at least were really fierce. I mean, even if you look at studying their art in pre-Italic times, they had this very true, genuinely Germanic, and also something that we can't fully understand, because basically the Longobards were Elbe Germans, just like the Alemanni, just to make an example. They had gravitated back in the day around the Suebic Confederation, but they had kind of stayed a bit on their own. Then they have this kind of mysterious past in the 4th, 5th century that we can't really read pretty well. But you understand, it was a very fierce world, like a very fierce warrior culture that believed into this kind of right of rule of the vanquisher. They had this pretty negative and tormented view of the universe, with this major snakes that devour men, and this dreadful, violent life that they had to endure there. Then obviously when they settle in Italy, things start to change, and what we'll observe today is this great path towards civilization that the Longobards managed to achieve remarkably well, and that is insultingly overlooked today in popular culture relatively to the migration era. That is really amazing in terms of civil progress and the Longobards arrived from those bases to the 8th century, where they're basically the most civilly advanced Romano-Germanic kingdom, and there is no doubt whatsoever, historiographically speaking, about this. And we'll partly see why, because today we will stop actually to Rotari in the mid-7th century, but the moment of foundation, and it is particularly important because we'll leave along and will be the base, a very solid and productive base. And obviously the myth of the Longobards, the terrible, violent vanquishers, is something that I've spent myself many hours on Schwerpunkt trying to explain in its inconsistency. I mean, most of these cliches are naturally, and that's normally what you would have expected anyway, which emerge from Papal and Byzantine letters that obviously were chiefly enemies of the Longobards for most. I mean, the Papacy not excessively really, but the Byzantines obviously, because they were contending after the migration the dominion of the Italian peninsula with them, but mostly actually from the papal propaganda of the very end of the Longobard kingdom, where they, those last decades that we have discussed, especially on that video on Heistulf, king of the Longobards, that show us how all of a sudden actually a relation was fairly good. The myth that the Longobards were kind of intolerant to want to destroy the papacy is pure fantasy. There is nothing like that. The Longobards get also Christianized and Catholicized because they were Arians actually, very relatively quickly, and especially without major struggles. There are no persecutions into Longobard Italy. There's no evidence of intolerance, of violence. There is actually a great cooperation, even through, and a lot of now it's very complicated. I promise I will make a clarificatory video one day on all these historiographical issues, because they were all born historiographically speaking. I mean, if you read the sources, like I have partly done in large measure, I mean, the picture that is showed is very clear. I mean, there is not really much you have to interpret from this, and many stereotypes and prejudices about the nefandissima gens, as it's called in Latin, one of the so the most dreadful people in one of the letters of the papacy, if I'm not wrong, or well, it was between the papacy and the Byzantines, however, is largely a historiographical myth. Even the devastation, when the Longobards arrive into Italy, just to continue the story, they have this relative cohesion under Alboin, that is now the king of the Longobards. Although it's the Longobards have they have a very solid, well-off middle class of freemen that sense had also worked pretty well in terms of cohesion and demographic strength against the other peoples out there. It seems that the Longobards were, because of their last victories in the last centuries, were particularly better off than other populations out there, including some that managed to crash, like the Gepids. Now we'll see it. They had absorbed at this point. And so they have this typical Germanic distrust towards the leadership, right? The Germans, as a norm, elected their kings, so-called kings, just with a military function. That is to say, when they were at war, they elect this king to lead the army, because that's a necessity. You need a hierarchist to make a society function properly, especially under a moment of pressure, etc. But for the rest, when the war was over, hopefully this leader would come back to be the usual chieftain of his own clan, and everything would be still kind of egalitarian this way. So what happens is that as long as the Longobards remain out there into the mess of Central Europe and all these enemies, etc., in this very militarized context, in a very tough environment, let's say, they kind of stick together. They realize the value of their cohesion. Once they arrive into Italy, there's free space for everybody. Italy is still, in spite of all, in spite of the Gallic War, in spite of the plague, still very incredibly rich, at least for whatever the Longobards could have ever imagined there. And therefore, what happens is that this, let's say, avatar of monarchical rule basically evaporates, and the Longobards spread all over the peninsula. And this is very. This was a very bad thing for the Longobards themselves, because actually, at that point they had numbers, if they had stuck together, to wipe out literally every single Byzantine soldier was up there in the peninsula. But they fragment, and therefore they dispersed their own strengths throughout the whole peninsula. That they even didn't quite understand geographically, in its geographical dimension at the beginning. I mean, some of them even entered into northern Italy, went raiding, crossing the Alps in places like Burgundy, and they get annihilated. And that's the moment where, things are very uncontrollable, right? And there are naturally, we can't expect ravages, pillaging, etc. But at the same time, there is settlement, and when you see that, you settle in one place to stay, you don't really destroy it. And leaving to say that there wasn't much left to really destroy, unless you wanted to starve yourself to death in that case into Italy after the Gothic War. So even this figure that Longobards arrive and destroy, and it's not supported by any evidence. Actually, their march through the Po Valley is particularly peaceful. There is no evidence of slaughters. The Ostrogothic garrisons of left there by the Byzantines in northeastern Italy get absorbed by the Longobards. Even the story of the siege of Pavia that would have allegedly lasted 3 years is seemingly just... only one source tells about it, and it seemingly is just imitating the for historiographical, cliche, the 3-year siege of Odoacer's Ravenna by Theodoric, Ostrogothic king, as it had happened like 80 years before. So this is all very, the idea is that the Longobards settled down, and there was probably really an agreement with the Byzantines at the beginning, also because the Byzantines do not do anything to stop them. So it is pretty meaningful, and in a general, picture of the story, the Byzantines literally do not do anything. They don't send any army, anyone. They probably wanted to create this kind of buffer state between Italy and the most fertile areas of Italy, were the center and the north, and the Franks, the Merovingian Franks. Now were getting pretty aggressive, right? And they had obviously looked upon Italy with great lust, as obviously kind of every Gallic power that existed there, even further ahead in the Middle Ages, would do, actually. So whatever this thing had gone, however, Alboin ruled. Alboin is a great hero in the Germanic epics. It's remembered by the Anglo-Saxon tradition, the Scandinavian, the whole Nordic tourism talks about it. And it's one of the great leader of men that was remained in the Germanic historical memory for a long time to come. And indeed, he had achieved pretty big goal. I mean, he had settled into Italy, bringing these people, and more like, really like a real conqueror than, like the even Theodoric had been. Think about Dietrich von Bern, all the legend of these great kings and warriors, etc. But at this point, even the capacity of the Roman Empire to contain this populations has weakened down, and probably we don't see much of the real story. That I personally, at least, I'm very convinced it was all settled with the Byzantines, right? Because it's too unclear what happened there. But unfortunately, sources are dramatically scanty. That there is a very few evidence about every. So we have to stay to reality, after all. So what happens, though, was pretty common actually among the Germanic kings, is that Alboin gets assassinated in 572, and Paul the Deacon tells us about this assassination, this plot, that basically this conspiracy that he kind of fictionalizes a little bit, saying basically that it had been his ordered by his wife, Rosmund, that was daughter of the Jebet king Conemund, that had been defeated and killed by the same Alboin before, in the Pannonian Basin, against the wars between the Longobards and the Jebets, and the royal squire Elmichis, that was this secondary figure, and that they both did it with the support of the Byzantines, and then eventually they fled there. And the story, it's a bit fictionalized, but actually pretty meaningful and realistic, because it tells about all the intrigues that at this time were running on after the settlement of the Longobards into Byzantine Italy, to try to contain this part of the Longobard people that evidently had this more kind of independent mindset, that wanted to stay on their own, considered this as a conquest rather than a sort of a permission from the side of the empire, and those Longobards that instead sided with the Byzantines, because they were effectively, like many other populations at the time, looking forward to being included into the empire to fight for them on this frontier, to enjoy this decentralized position, and so on. So at this point, the real problem for the unity of the Longobard people is not even the Byzantines themselves, so actually playing on this, but the Longobards themselves, because there was no real cohesion at this point. And because when Alboin dies, Clef is elected king, this other Longobard duke, and he's also assassinated after like 2 years of rule. So what follows is this so-called this phase known as Longobard anarchy that lasts 10 years, which is not a few, between 574 and 584, in fact. That is really like the worst period. It's really the one of major chaos in this situation, where every duke basically started to do on his own and didn't really look forward. Like, this wasn't definitely a very short-sighted move, because at the same time the Byzantines were working pretty hard, even with diplomacy, and even calling the Franks now at this point, to get rid of the Longobards, because they realized that they didn't have enough force to, at that point, to contain them and to integrate them into the system. So what happens is that the same Longobard dukes decide not to elect a king, right? Because remember that here, it's always a monarchy is always elective, right? And this is something that will remain in every kind of Germanic environment. I mean, even in the High Middle Ages and Full Middle Ages, when there is still the king, the monarchy is very well shaped as institutionally, etc. It's still theoretically the noblemen of the kingdom that elect, right? So this is the moment of which it was all closest to tradition, and the dukes decide willingly, or maybe because there was too much dissent or not interest, not to elect a king, not to elect a guide. And this might as well be actually a step forward towards the Byzantine direction, to say, let's simply settle these guys down, let's control them, which is so actually, because at this point naturally the Longobards had become a problem, or at least they had been they had revealed themselves too difficult to control. But back in the day, actually the same dynasty that Alboin had been part of had been consistently backed and supported by the same Constantinople there, because they preferred to have, like, instead of a set of different clans that would do essentially whatever the hell they liked, including launching raids into Byzantine territory, by appointing a leader, there was kind of a referential figure that the empire could talk to, like saying, okay, let's deal, and you will control. I mean, I will give you power, and you will control now your aristocracy on my behalf in some way. So naturally, the Longobards hadn't quite ever been a sort of Byzantine puppet, but they had been introduced to the system, and like, it really had worked. The Longobards actually knew Italy since they had, I mean, obviously they had known it somewhat before, but they had been fighting into Italy under the Byzantines during the Gothic War. They had kind of realized what it was like. Probably you can imagine these warriors coming back through their their Pannonian area and saying, talking about this land that was still, as we have seen, pretty fertile, pretty florid, and that definitely exalted their wishes, their dreams, their lust for wealth, for riches, and so on. So, and always having remember that the Germans this time didn't absolutely have any sort of inferiority complex towards the Romans. They genuinely believed that they were basically superior to them, or at least not inferior. Now I don't open my usual digression on the symbolism of the empire, but let's say that at least the imperial symbolism was something important for the Germans as well. It's never been like the Romans versus the Germans. Never been like that. Seriously. The Germans were completely obsessed by Roman imperial symbolism and power, actually, and they wanted to share it because they recognized it too, that the common Indo-European deity of the sky, that whichever you consider it, like whether Christian or pagan, and like you would still try to follow, because that's what people at the time believed military glory actually derived from. So settling into Italy was a big thing. That had been the core of the Roman Empire, right? So although the Longobards, and this is the cool thing, and that's why the Longobards were so dramatically estimated actually by all the other Germans, is that they never gave up, especially those who had settled into the ex-Roman territories, that never gave up their strictly Germanic institutions. I mean, the Franks, even the Goths, they kind of got in part heavily Romanized in a way or another, or at least they inspired themselves to certain Roman models. Even the Longobards, naturally, for settling in a place like Italy, underwent some sort of Romanization, but actually their institutions, both political and juridical, had always remained markedly Germanic, and they never tried to assume any kind of imperial dimension to their kingdom. The only thing they did was to say, okay, that Italy proper, I mean, Italy geographically meant, was to be their kingdom. That's something they started to stress basically immediately. You find it on all this. Now we will see now the Longobards after 584 elect. They found the kingdom proper, right? And after that, their horizon is set onto the peninsula. That is to say, the Byzantines must go out of here, and it's kind of a normal thing, because Italy has a pretty evident, geographical definition, and it's a place that it makes sense strategically to conquer all in one block, right? And since the Longobards obviously were always muscle to muscle with the Byzantines into the peninsula at very close range, they always tried to stress, to emphasize the strictly Italian dimension of their territorial dominion, right? Even though they were actually grounded mostly into the Po Valley, eventually into Tuscany as well. That was really the core of the kingdom, especially that political direction, etc. But also northeastern Italy. But we will see that how that was really. And so, what happens is that after this period of anarchy, things get pretty messed up, because now we have to skip so many passages, but to make a long story short, the Byzantines and the Franks managed to launch this offensive on the Longobards, so they freak out rightfully, and because those were really the most powerful entities existing in Europe, so they need a military leader. And they finally understand, they kind of abandon. This was very important from a civil point of view, because the Longobards have a very deeply rooted individualistic mindset, like all the Germans from the spring, right? And they have arrived now straight from Central Europe into a completely different environment. So they have the intelligence in a relatively few time to say, okay, we can't go on like we were used, or as we thought it could work. We need to elect a king. We need to give ourselves a leader. We need to invest resources into war, because that's basically what it was all about, in order to preserve their own strength and power. They're actually to be spared from annihilation, because at that point that's really what they were risking, and they elect a king, which is the Duke Authari, that will rule as a king of the Longobards from 584 to 509. He was actually son of Clef. What did actually founding the kingdom mean? Well, naturally, the center, that now the you can argue that up to this point, the Longobard kingdom had been relatively polycentric. That were kind of different, say, capitals. But the major center of power, the one could be better controlled and to have a kind of a more strategical sense, was in the area around Milan. Pavia had been a capital of consistent, power back in the day, even during. At least it was a very strong importance center. Milan was close. It was a bit at this crossroad between Central Europe, Southern Europe, and it was relatively, a fertile area around, and it was a fairly good place to rule from. And what this is important because there is still a kind of a Roman infrastructural legacy in here in this very first. Generations of the Longobard kingdom. There was seemingly a consistent group of still of properly Roman, if not intellectuals, at least administrators, of people who could help the Longobards even to organize now a complex administration that was unknown naturally to what think about this semi-nomadic lifestyle these warriors out there, how it had been, and to have especially this political center, because that was what they more than else they had, the Longobards had lacked. So there is another big step that also makes you understand why the dukes initially didn't want to create a monarchy. It was really giving a consistent part of the ducal lands to the king. That is like a donation, right? And this was fairly important because that means this is a mean of centralization. Basically, that means to maintain the army, to draw resources for maintaining the army and having an autonomous monarchical lead, right? That can cope, hopefully, at least with the major threats that at this point were pretty much out there. And Alboin also marries a key figure in Longobard history, that is Theodolinda. Theodolinda is daughter of the Bavar Duke, but she was also, she descended from one of the Lathingian dynasty that had been actually the Longobard, let's say, monarchic dynasty into a phase in which the Longobards into Central Europe during the migrations had basically elected these leaders in order to rule and to get across Central Europe in this quite troublesome situation. So you need a military leader to do that. So there was this interesting, also kind of marriage ties at this point in history, very, very interesting between within all these various Germanic populations, because there is a lot of strategy in there. And Theodolinda, however, is mostly important for cultural reasons, because she's actually Catholic. Alboin, like the average Longobard, especially aristocrat at this time, would be an Arian. The Arian creed had been adopted by the Longobards as a form of Germanism. It's not that the Longobard people actually believed now. It was very superficially, at least, Christianized. When you see Arianism, it was a conversion to Christianity, chiefly carried out by accepted by the elites to be essentially acceptable in face of the Roman Empire, to say something like, okay, we are Christians, so now you can't deal with us, but we're still different. And this Arianism had become a synonym of kind of Germanism, at least in the way we interpret it today, to say, yeah, we are kind still of a different thing. We want to deal with you, dear Romans, but always remember that we are different and that we are intrinsically better, by the way, because that was the Germanic ideal, warlike idea. The Bavars now were this other people of the late migration era that, differently from these other Germanic populations, wasn't quite ethnically defined properly. In fact, they didn't even take name from a confederation or a place of origin, but simply they take the name from after the Boianum, so what would be today's the Bohemia, this people that this name derived from the Boy, they were a Celtic population that inhabited there, and they're a mix of I mean, probably also in here the dominant ethnic character is Germanic, but it's plenty of other populations like Celts, Romanized populations, other peoples that came from who knows where, Iranic, Turkish, and all this stuff, but they settle in this upper Danube area that is just north of Italy, basically, and that's very important because you can't control the Alpine passes. So basically, the Bavars never had quite perfect relations with the Longobards either, but they were kind of more, tendentially they preferred the Longobards at least to the Merovingians, to the Franks in general. In fact, the Bavars were seemingly, they weren't even a kingdom, they were a duchy, right? So this is kind of a lesser title that tells you that they were kind of a B-series power. They came from dukes, obviously. There is this that indicates this kind of military leadership, but it's not like the Rex, the king, as that is loaded with way deeper and greater and even partially more kind of ideological and symbolical and authoritative meanings. So, and Theodolinda will be dramatically important, especially under the following king, because she will actually appoint and marry him. We're talking about Agilulf. We will see it now. So, but talking about authority, and she began to spread this idea that it was more convenient, especially in a country like Italy. It was of old Catholicization, that it would be more prudent, given that now the kingdom was being founded in here, and the Longobards were relatively few. I mean, compared to the local populations, like the Longobards were something like from 1% to 3% of the whole the population of the peninsula. So you realize that, exhausted this kind of initial military character of the kind of warlike character, the Longobards get easily mixed with and diluted with local populations, and they become properly grounded to that. And that's something very clever that will take the Longobards some time. Actually, like most of the Aryan Romano-Germanic kingdoms that always have this kind of troubled phase in which the only Germans that basically pass straight at this point from paganism to Catholicism are the Franks, or better, the Merovingian Franks, actually. And that also, in fact, ensures to the Merovingian dynasty an incredible edge in terms of social pacification and ability to really root even the same monarchy in that point. We've made lots of videos about the Merovingians. If you're interested, you can go look the Migration Era playlist. So, but what is crucial in here is really now not much religion, that is actually was never quite of dramatic importance into Longobard affairs, as it's properly believed most of the times. The way, at least the history I've heard it told around. But rather the strictly military matters that now are pretty serious, and they have to be handled with great force and great energy. In fact, with authority, what happens is that this king really commits himself into the literal beheading of all the Longobard rebel nobility. So that is to say, all the Longobards that were siding at that point with the Byzantines, right? And at this time, the Byzantine army has an incredible high amount of Longobard mercenaries. We find them fighting in places like Armenia. They're scattered everywhere. There are military commanders that they come from. Maybe were not even Longobards, but they had migrated into Italy with the Longobards. You know that for instance, 20,000 Saxons had seemingly joined the Longobards into Italy. Then when they arrived there, basically the Longobards tried to assimilate them, ethnically speaking. It was basically to make them become Longobards and subjects the same. And they say, hell no, we are out of here. They come back to Saxony. This is a true story, by the way. The Longobards, by the way, had a very, very intense, very close tie with the Saxons. They kind of always remained kind of friend. They had a very strong connection at that point, which was very, very interesting, by the way. The Longobards had actually relations with all the Germanic, Romano-Germanic kingdoms out there, like, well, even up to Anglo-Saxon England, etc. But aside from this, what happens is that after this ceaseless military exertions, Alboin manages to really extend the control of the Longobard monarchy proper into the Po Valley. He wipes out, when I say literally beheading, is that he really got every and each one of these noblemen and massacred them. And this is really how sometimes you really have to do, you know, the idea that you can't handle certain situations with just kind of diplomacy is pretty naive. You know, when we are wall against wall, take the sword in your hand, you start massacring people at will. And that's really what happens in here. And this is really hard, but at the same time it ensures the grounding and the basis of the Longobard kingdom that, and I can't stress this enough, was never, from this point onwards, never, not even once, not even a single time, contested by any other Longobard, right? We will see now how the myth that somehow the Longobard kingdom was just as a bunch of unruly duchies with no central power is a dead and buried historiographical myth that has never had a place into factual history from what we have it from our sources. At this point, at least the Po Valley is secured under the kings of Pavia. So the kingdom at this point it still has to expand, right? There is this center of the Po Valley that is kind of intuitively, you know, of some strategic value because it's surrounded by the Alps, by the Apennines, and it has a sort of, you know, pretty evident geographical. It's called a flatland. It's a valley, but it's kind of flat. It's relatively fertile, so it's a good place where to base a power, right? And northeastern Italy in this phase is not really directly controlled by the king, but at this point it's perfectly in line. It will always remain actually perfectly in line in terms of strategical interests with the capital, because the northeastern Longobards, the so-called Austrians, that have not to do with the modern country of Austria, but you know, it's like in Francia, among the Franks, you know, there is Neustria and Austrasia, right, in west and east. The Longobards have the same exact thing in the Po Valley, Neustria in the west and Austria in the east. And Austria is, by the way, the hub of in many ways of the truest, let's say, and most traditional Longobard spirit and traditions and ethnicity and identity in general, simply because it's a much less urbanized area than Western Po Valley is. There's a kind of a lower population density, and it's a kind of frontier region. Like the interest of the Austrians, if we can call them in this way, was to basically secure the eastern border of the kingdom, to fight against the Avars and the Slavs that carried out raids chiefly into some were pretty devastating, by the way, into this northeastern area of the peninsula, and they were pretty good. I mean, there was some warfare now and then among this duke or another, but the monarchical institution was never ever contested, also because it had been rightfully elected according to Germanic right, to Longobard right, through the election of the military assembly of the people. That was really the only juridical base to give any kind of validity in terms of social contract understood what was happening, and all the other dukes basically recognized it. And the myth at this point, you know, that the Longobards now are present even in other chunks of Italy, like in the center. There's the Duchy of Spoleto that is like in the heart of the Apennine, and then in the south, the Duchy of Benevent. The Duchy of Benevent is pretty interesting because it seemingly was born even before the Longobard kingdom, because seemingly these Beneventan Longobards were part of those veterans of the Gothic War that had not gotten back to the Danubian Valley, but they had been settled there as a garrison by the Byzantines. So what it seems to have happened is that, first of all, they were much more Romanized, and they have, in fact, the Duchy of Benevent is pretty large, and it has also kind of a good administration, more centralized one than the other duchies. And then when the bulk of the Longobard people invades the north, basically the Beneventan Longobards managed to kind of rebel or to autonomize themselves from the Byzantine rule, and they joined the kingdom afterwards. And even if you look at it, because I made a video accidentally about incidentally, actually not also accidentally, kind of, given the way I choose my topics. And the idea is that the southern duchies, according to tradition, they were kind of unruly, right? And there is no evidence of this, that they didn't believe to be part of the kingdom. Absolutely false. They absolutely believed to be part of the Longobard kingdom because they were part of the Longobard people, and you can't stress enough how proud the Longobards were about their ethnic origin. As a people proper, and it is true that sometimes these duchies kind of went astray, like kind of they didn't want to, maybe, but never actually cooperated actively for the destruction of the monarchy. The Duchy of Spoleto was actually, which is even was the closest one to the Po Valley from that side. You sometimes sided with the Byzantines actually, but it was a kind of a smaller power, and it never gave problems in terms. It didn't have any measure to threaten the unity of the Po Valley kingdom. It didn't have. They could just side with the Byzantines to cut off the communications with the south, but that was it practically. And the whole problem was settled just by sending an army, led by the king, and there was not even need to fight. Basically, most of the times, the king would just march on the city, would appoint his own official there, and would go away. And normally, when that official died, maybe the local nobility could elect one duke once again to say, okay. But there was never something like secession or rebellion. And actually, the Duchy of Benevent was the larger one, was always aligned with the kingdom. In fact, even one king was elected from there. So it's this myth is, as I said before, I don't have time to explain you now how it was formed, but in other videos I've been more precise, more explicit, more vocal, let's say, about this, and you can check it out. But these are really the essentials, and yeah, it kind of went on. So getting to Agilulf, now Author seemingly gets assassinated actually too, so there's not a much greater variety on the theme on this, but assassination is pretty much out there now as a regular mean of deposition. Thinking about Roman emperors. Agilulf is elected, is actually elected by Theodolinda herself. Now this is particularly interesting because it's one of those cases that show you how important women actually were into Longobard society, how they were revered in some way, that they were, obviously they were kind of be serious individuals. They had less rights, they had but the idea is that being some kind of a weaker individual, they needed protection. We'll see now, chiefly later when we talk about this in Longobard laws. But in the Germanic tradition, this is something that even Tacitus talks about, is that the Germans gave this great importance to what women could said in terms of advice, of premonitions, of this greater wisdom that it was believed to have actually a divine origin, that the woman in her sensitivity was kind of a medium of. So what happens when Authori dies is that Theodolinda is led to choose the successor that would become naturally also her own husband. And in the Longobard, and she chooses Agilulf, and the rest of the Longobard nobility accepts this. And obviously, this is kind of the romantic story, but it's evident that there was a kind of a general consensus in general that Theodolinda obviously was. She was a very clever woman, actually, as we will see now. So she probably had her own ambition as well, and she knew how to deal with things politically, but it's still important that she managed to form this consensus around her choice, and that the Longobard nobility agreed with her, and she was now very important. Agilulf, by the way, was of Thuringian origin, that is to say, the Central European Germanic people that now was being basically chopped down by the Franks and Saxons combined, and these were some of the ethnicities that had migrated with the Longobards into Italy as well. There were Swabians, there were Saxons, Thuringians, and even other non-Germanic populations. We can imagine Iranic peoples like the Sarmatians, etc., but even Turks or Slavs for that matter. But that there was an astonishing surprise that I had. I want to thank the user who commented that, by the way, on one of those videos on the Longobards. I'm sure you can find that. It showed me that actually there was a couple of genomes found into northern Italy and in Hungary of Longobard origin. It turns out that in some samples, some of these Longobards, or wherever they were, they had, ethnically speaking, they had an astonishingly similar genetic patrimony to modern Polish people. So that is also quite, dramatically fascinating. If you think about all these various migrations. By the way, the Longobards were in the Icelandic sagas. They're just this celestial twins, like the Dioscuri of tradition, Vinil and Vandil. That would be basically the Vinili were the ancient name the Longobards had before the Odinic ethnonym of the Longobards, Longbeard, they had. And Vandil would be the Vandals, basically. And there is, in fact, in the myth of the origins of the Longobards, there are the Vandals. Actually, Longobards defeat the Vandals on the island of Rügen, seemingly, to pass, because the Vandals didn't want to pass. And today, we like to say that the Germanic, the Longobards kind of Germanic and Sarmatian kind of in origin, because of these migratory movements, especially during the Hunnic times, in which a lot of these peoples of Sarmatians were pushed westwards to be assimilated with these other Germanic groups. The Vandals were kind of a Germano-Slavic people, or Proto-Slavic, given the origin also of like the Lugi from which we think the Vandals kind of emerged, were right now in what is the very center of Poland, which is brutally fascinating, in my opinion. So think of all these blendings, and you're understanding there what we think by ethnic identities in the migration era. So the kingdom of Agilulf is particularly important. He ruled between 590 and 616, right? Now, Agilulf was an Arian as well. As we have seen, Theodolinda was Catholic. And because the Bavars had followed kind of the Frankish example, they had converted straight from paganism, I believe, at least, and in fact they passed through Arianism. But also this is to Catholicism, but this is also of relative importance in substance. But the point is, now Agilulf goes on with the process of military consolidation, right? Because that's never over, especially in these times in history where, you know, building something solid is definitely, there is always someone to fight, essentially. But now the kingdom is well formed, and there are cultural advancements that happen in the meanwhile. So what happens especially is this progressive relief of tension with especially with the papacy. We wouldn't say with the Byzantines proper, but with the papacy proper. That's why Theodolinda is important, because she actually exchanges letters with Gregory the Great, and this is a great path of civilization, in my opinion. Agilulf allows Saint Columba to found the famous monastery of Bobbio, and therefore there is this greater importance given to the relation with the church. Agilulf remains an Arian, and we'll explain now why, from a strictly political point of view rather a religious one. But he also lets his son actually being baptized according to the Catholic rite, and there is this progressive, blending of dilution of the Longobard Germanic Aryan element into what was the Romanic Italian population, and this kingdom has naturally to restart, importantly also from the relations with the church. That was very important into Italy, as you can imagine, and this, especially the city bishops in it were particularly important. They had the cities were the core of the Longobard kingdom. It's also very important to remind that while peoples like the Franks, they didn't quite, they settled in cities sometimes, even the monarchs, etc. But the city is not really the big center, right? It's a much more rural world. Longobard Italy is a urban kingdom, if you want. It starts from the idea of the palatium, like the one of Pavia, that is, in this sense, not just a symbol, but actually an administrative center. So there is a tribunal, there's a court, there's a real center, right, from which a real administration is structured and operates. And the closing with the papacy is particularly important, because the Longobards realize that if they get softer on the religious side, that after all they didn't really care much about themselves, because they were barely Christian, as we have seen, and now they were, however, blending with the Christian population. So there was no reason to maintain that kind of intransigent Arianism at the base of the relations, even with the population. There was no need to complicate the story, right? So the idea is that, first of all, that can give more solidity to the kingdom in itself. Agilulf, by the way, backs Rome against the charades of Constantinople. It kind of goes nuts, because, apparently at least, because it kind of starts backing heresies out there in the east, because they is trying to do everything to maintain those Near Eastern and North African provinces that do not want to pay taxes to Constantinople. So they stress other heresies. So the emperors try to keep everything together by leaning it from the side of those heresies. Then obviously the Arabs arrive and they conquer everything, also because of thanks to those heresies that literally open the gates of those provinces to the Muslims. And that's quite important, because the papacy has a great relevance in the political and even, say, military balance of the peninsula. It's not really a big military power. It's actually formally not even an autonomous entity. Even though de facto is becoming, but I mean, it's not really a great military power, but it's exactly the political, spiritual, religious influence of the papacy that can really change a lot. There is the papacy now is also representing this more properly Romano-Italic culture that is important from the sort of kind of Greco-Byzantine one. That you know, that never this the Italy was Byzantine, but kind of by name, because it was a possession. So there was a great happiness for the local inhabitants for being under Byzantine rule. Interestingly enough, actually, many populations, especially of the Byzantine hinterland, abandoned the empire, passing from the Longobard side, because the Longobards had much lower taxes. They had a way less imposing bureaucracy. So they actually, there is this shift. So to say that Longobard Italy was not at all bad, as some would like to picture it, like there's this the narrative that everything that stays from the Byzantine side is cool and outside are just a bunch of barbarians. It's not really like that. By the way, Byzantine and Longobard territories in Italy are very also similar to each other. Also because Byzantine administration in Italy is quite decentralized in the first place from Constantinople, but the idea is that the Papacy in fact doesn't quite like too much the Byzantines, because the Byzantines would like even to control the Bishop of Rome and telling him what to do, what to say. But now Rome is a kind of a still big system. It's still the largest city in Western Europe. It's a kind of a system that starts working even on its own. The popes also do not quite control the city entirely, but they have a great even economical power that they have. They're really important to balance the whole equilibrium of the peninsula. So the Longobards understand that if they want to strengthen their position into Italy, they have to be more friendly with the Papacy, right? And by the way, the Longobards had done even pretty harsh things. Rome had been as a Byzantine center at war against the Longobards. The Longobards had sent had ravaged the surroundings of the city. They had sold the local Roman population like slaves to other peoples, like the Franks, and so this was pretty dark times. I wouldn't like to leave you with the idea that somewhat everything was fine and nice just because we're talking about the Longobards that I evidently like at this point, but it was a really miserable, violent, deeply unjust, and world, and we have always to picture history in these terms, because otherwise we get our perception kind of too idealized and ultimately realistic, inaccurate, say. So there is this progressive conversion from Arianism to Catholicism of the royal family, as we've seen, and also of part, at least, of the Longobard aristocracy. It wasn't really an intense acceleration of this process. I mean, it took still some time. We can't say that a full Catholicization of the Longobards takes the whole 7th century, but it was very formal. You don't have to think of this really as a conflictual story. Much of this idea is that the stamp is somehow is that basically there were some attritions between the Longobard aristocracy gravitating around the monarchy itself and the power, as always. So there was a lot of competition. So what happened is that it was theoretically, at least from these sources, this kind of Arian party and let's say nationalist Arian party, if you want, and the Philo-Catholics, right? And the idea is that these two parties struggled. They kind of fought against each other. Sometimes even, that escalated into open warfare. The monarchy was never discussed by neither of the two, also because the Arians were, solidly, also pro-monarchic, ideally, in the Germanic fashion. The Catholics were, didn't have any interest for taking out the monarchy. It was not about religion, really. And there are some episodes in which you realize they even switched allegiance according to what the political balance really was. So there were just names, as it often happens historically speaking. You know, religious matters, especially where they're so subtle, like in a context of, seventh century, like with differences, Germanic people barely Romanized between being an Arian and a Catholic is, it's obvious that religion has no importance whatsoever in this context. They were just names, and there was never really a religious struggle in this sense, nor there was among the population, because that could have been produced by saying, rebellions of Catholics from the cities, slaughters, persecutions. There was nothing like that. There were just a bunch of Longobard aristocrats who were trying to compete for being elected as next monarchs, and there were just the two parties that you could say, Catholics and Arians, like the blues and the reds. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything more than that, right? And historiography really insisted sometime for many years. I mean, many years ago as well, but. On this story, that there was somewhat a sort of cultural clash behind that there was a part of the aristocracy that wanted to maintain the true origins of the traditions of the Germans, the ancient, even kind of Arianism that used to mask paganism fundamentally. There is no evidence of this. There is no evidence at the end of the story. So, even though it is true that the second half of the 7th century, there was some struggle in this sense, the monarchy was not damaged, because that was not the objective of anyone, to damage the monarchy. The monarchy was pretty convenient to have all of these clienteles that could, in fact, battle over the competition within the same institutions to reach to the top. Right, and this was true, by the way, also in the local administration, in all the various, how the structure of the Longobard kingdom was civilly conceived, right? So, looking at a bit of a geographical dimension as well, and political at the same time, in the first phase of the conquest, basically, we've said it before roughly, that the Longobard kingdom was structured into duchies now, right? So the duchy was effectively a political and territorial entity. The duke was nothing but the military leader or the clan leader that had settled into that place and began to rule from there. And usually this duchy was nothing new. There was always an administrative continuity with the older. All the duchies were centered around the city and around the boundaries of its district from the Roman administration boundaries, and how it was in perfect continuity with the Roman institutions. And that's also normal, because the Romans had built the cities with this exact aim of, with a rational disposition, with a kind of geographical, strategical sense in this sense. And these duchies were ruled initially completely by the duke, that, as we've seen, at one point was even kind of devoid of a king over him, and he could do whatever he wanted. Then eventually the power gets delegated increasingly to the king, that naturally expands his power even actively from his own side. So these duchies are roughly 30, and each one is it's kind of an entity on its own, right? There are no other subdivisions. It's the duke, the duchy, and that's pretty much it, and the clan that has historically settling there. So, while you can imagine even the cities placed on the major routes of communication, etc. So even these duchies were important. By the way, there were other peoples that had different names. Like the dux is a pretty military title. Like the Franks used the term comes. That is still kind of like the not really the let's say it kind of has a relatively more civil meaning, to make the long story short. But it's still, in the case of the Longobards, that wanted really to identify the very strongly military nature of the duchy. Yeah. So there were some capitals as well. For instance, Pavia, as we have seen, was the true capital of the kingdom, but there had been also Verona initially, that had been, for instance, the capital of Alboin, right? And these were cities that were amongst some of the largest ones in Europe at the time. Really, you know, as relatively tiny as they could be, they were still Roman cities that had maintained this chiefly strategical importance into northern Italy, basically northern Italy wasn't quite developed at this time, because since ancient times, like the Po Valley had remained a relatively emarginated areas. Like the true trade routes were chiefly between central and southern Italy and southern France. They skipped the Po Valley. It was relatively even unhealthy with the swamps, especially in the later Roman Empire. Those had taken over once again, but it still had maintained a kind of a solid. In fact, by the way, the Longobards even fence off the Frankish and Byzantine invasion at one point by enclosing themselves in the cities and letting the heat and the illness decimating the enemy armies. So that was a pretty clever way even to but these cities had maintained their own power, their own military function. They were fortified centers. They had their own Roman infrastructures, and there were other fairly important cities out there. Cividale, for instance, in Friuli, that was this the capital of Austria, if you want. The Friuli was, some of the most powerful duchy of northeastern Italy in that strongly Austrian character. Then there was Treviso as well, Bergamo, Brescia, Turin, Lucca. We'll see Tuscany was eventually conquered progressively directly by Pavia, so that was an area over which the monarchy really controlled directly and kind of got rid of the various dukes progressively, right? Because another advantage into this is that even though the ducal families tended to be kind of hereditary, still there was this idea of splitting of election even for the duchies in some way. So it was fairly easy to exploit this theoretically democratic or egalitarian Germanic tradition to actually seize the opportunity to elect your own appointee fundamentally, and that's how it mostly happens without even needing bloodshed or warfare in that sense to take place. And all these cities knew under the Longobard kingdom, so very far actually from decadence, a true increase in importance, like the administrative center and the center of economic and social life, and especially in connection with the Longobard kingdom. That is, these cities as ducal capitals became particularly important and vital. Remember that in Italy, cities never quite die out. They keep living on. That's the region in Europe where cities maintain their greater life, even more than arguably than the same Byzantine Empire, at least on the long run. These centers become quite autonomous, quite wealthy, quite powerful. In the Byzantine rule tends to progressively choke, but kind of say it takes several centuries. It's not really the case at the moment. Actually, the Byzantine Empire is solidly shaped around cities as well, but there is also a kind of a decline in part. So the different approach that the southern duchies had towards this story was that they knew they were detached from the center of the kingdom. So, as we've said before, they were not really interested in seceding from the kingdom, but they liked to enjoy this decentralized position and having even this autonomous political initiative in the relations both with the papacy and with the Byzantine Empire, and that's why Spoleto and Benevent were fairly conceived, at least fairly autonomous, right? But they never were quite independent, right? They were always still recognizing the king in Pavia and paying, participating to the army and having this this general allegiance towards the king and the Longobard people, because probably one factor that was very important in here is that the Longobards were basically the only successful example of an elective monarchy into the Romano-Germanic kingdoms. Like, seriously, I mean, they were, if you look at, the Visigoths went, it was a disaster. Basically, it progressively eroded the monarchy in favor of nobility. The Franks decide to skip that and they get directly to a dynasty with all the exception that represents. Other kingdoms are really not very unitary, at least for a very long time. The other episode is naturally the Anglo-Saxon one, but that became something unitary, say, far beyond the life of the Longobard kingdom. Eventually was conquered by the Franks. So actually this thing works because the nobility is actually delegates monarchical power, and the reason why it doesn't take over like it happened in Spain, for instance, is that it's paradoxically the misfortune of Italy in itself. The fact that during the Gothic War, the great estates, the senatorial estates that had been the base of the Roman economy, etc., had gone destroyed, and therefore the land was divided in all these various plots of much smaller landowners, that when the Longobards arrived, really they kind of joined this kind of egalitarian Germanic model by saying, okay, they didn't want any the same Longobards didn't want any strong prevalent aristocracy to be formed that could compete. Actually, in this, the Longobards were lucky because they were fragmented themselves at the beginning, so they didn't give rise to anything. Well, structurally speaking, everything was already kind of destroyed, so probably they would have not achieved it anyway, but they kind of have a moderate aristocracy. I mean, there is no comparison. This is what I always say, that Italy at this time is still, from Roman times, the richest country in the world per capita, which means that the average Italian inhabitant owns more wealth in absolute terms than any other country in the world, any other people in the world. But so this means that the middle class, the small, medium owners are really kind of well off for those time standards. In other countries, it wasn't like that. For example, in Gaul, where the Roman estates had remained fairly intact, what happens is that there is a local aristocracy that is dramatically wealthier than the average inhabitant, and it progressively, especially with the fragmentation of the Merovingian kingdom, constantly impoverishes the rest. It rises as a sort of private aristocratic force that is also very wealthy. In Italy there is nothing like this. I mean, even an average Frankish nobleman at this point could have easily way more land than the same Longobard king, and the aristocracy had even less. So you can imagine what this meant is that the only way to make money, this was very important, civilly speaking, for a Longobard aristocrat, was actually joining into the royal administration of the getting appointed as an administrator of local cities and working at court in the offices, etc., so that there was a competition within the system and not from the external to destroy the system, like instead was like in France, where actually a true centralized system was quite never formed, but the Merovingians had attempted some sort of things at the beginning where things were still going fairly well. Then eventually they split their kingdom into 4 at every generation, and everything goes irreversibly declining, so that we don't talk about Frankish kingdom anymore, more probably about Frankish kingdoms, because that's what they practically were. So there is also some speculation about what could be actually, for example, the monarchical authority into southern Italy at one point, because the idea is that they up to that point, let's say, expeditions against the southern duchies weren't quite necessary, nor probably not even interesting or positive to do. So probably the moment in which the Beneventan duchy was really fully integrated into the kingdom was at the election of the Beneventan king Grimoald, that ruled from Pavia actually between 663 and 671. At that point, actually, part of the Longobard aristocracy didn't recognize him because there had been some struggles, etc. But nobody said, okay, well, you're not really the king, or I mean, I don't remember actually if it was really the case, but I mean, there was no critique to the royal institution as such, not even when there were this lack of effective control on the local aristocracy. But that was an exception, also because Grimoald was the only Beneventan king. So, but in any case, there were some bonds that were being formed. For instance, the Duchy of Benevent was particularly close to the one of Friuli, which might be strange because, you know, southern Italy, northeastern Italy, it's not that they have a lot in common, but there were these dynasties, even marriage ties and all this stuff it was a matter of clientele, so families of power that was shared. In fact, since Paul the Deacon is the major source of the Longobard history of the Longobard kingdom, and there were these ties with Benevent, we are consistently better documented in Beneventan duchy than the same Neustria, for example, aside from Friuli, that naturally Paul the Deacon tells a lot about, obviously being his native land. But so this has to be taken into consideration. But how did then the Longobard kings really rule on this land? So initially, the same dukes had some functionaries of lesser dignity, actually, so that really didn't have any let's say official or even aristocratic merit. For instance, there was the Skuldahis, right? Was this kind of second this administrator, etc. Or more Latin names that indicate actually there were kind of NCOs in the army, like the Centenari or Decani, that is the commanders of 100 or 10 respectively. And there were also other officers, even in the local police, territory patrol. There was this kind of a relatively autonomous but fairly homogeneous military organization in the Longobard kingdom as such. And actually the king had the very same functionaries in terms of of his own control of his territory, but also higher officers, however, that now were chosen exactly with the task of extending the royal power, the royal control, administratively speaking, juridically speaking, legally speaking, into ducal territory. So the Longobard kings were quite clever. They created this figure of the Gastals, right? Gastaldi in Latin, that were appointed by the sovereign himself, and they could be, in fact, simply taken out of office at will, at his own will. So this was a pretty flexible measure, and that also tells you that the myth that centralization belongs only to the modern world is kind of false. This is evidently a measure of centralization, centralized power with delegated power, etc. So this figure of the Gastals increases in importance because to their functions are started to be added many powers into the judiciary sphere. They enter, in fact, to interfere, let's say, into the ducal administration of those duchies that were not quite under the had not been, at least up to that point, under monarchical control, by presenting themselves essentially as the representatives of the king in person from a juridical point of view. Now, in the Germanic tradition, the king was the supreme judge as well. Also, he had to have, in fact, this kind of wise character and understanding, because that was considered as hierarchically speaking, as a necessity of the local administration. And what the Longobard kings do is something extremely clever, because they basically reproduce in every duchy a palace that was basically meant to be the same one, even if on a smaller scale, than the one of Pavia. This is particularly important because when you look at the palace, the term palatium really means stone. It means a building that, by the way, echoes pretty strongly the Roman political and administrative tradition. So something permanent, something that even ideologically speaking is telling you that this monarchy really wants to last. That is really a bulwark against any form of anarchy and etc. So they create this, and they're endowed in this sense with some land, so that the Gastald is properly in charge of this palace, of the property that belongs to the king, of course, but is administered locally by the Gastald on the king's behalf. And this palace has the same functions of the one of Pavia, that is, the judicial ones. So basically what happens in this is that every subject of that duchy, that obviously can presume that every duke had his own residence, his own, maybe not palace all the time, but evidently something, from the city that ruled. Even the cities had their own administration. So every subject, every ducal subject, could go to the Gastald, right? Could go to the palace it's as if it had been the palace of Pavia itself. It could ask for justice, right? It could make a quest for justice, because there was a Longobard traditional law that, as we will see now, it kind of was eventually written down, so there were some modifications, but the Longobards were quite proud about their law, because, by the way, the true ethnic discriminant at this point is truly not really what you look like, but or where you come from, but really what kind of law you're under. Like this is even like in later on in Carolingian times, in this great multi-ethnic empire with Franks, Longobards, Saxons, etc. You have several different laws of all these ethnic groups that had made the Romano-Germanic Europe, and you could effectively choose. This existed also in the Longobard kingdom, for example. You could make a contract under the Roman law, even if you were a Longobard, for example, because maybe for that transaction, that was more convenient for you to do. So it was a lot of flexibility, but in general, if you had to choose, however, usually at least, what kind of law you were, right? So, and that was quite important, because if you were a Longobard, you were a true freeman. Like, being a Roman, now there is a lot of discussion relatively to this, because many people think, well, now the Romans were kind of all slaves or semi-freemen. This doesn't seem to be quite true, and especially the reason why we don't know much about it, which is what has led historiography to very great mistakes, is not because the Longobards had really emarginated and oppressed the Romans, and this is a mythical perception. It's simply that all the people at this time, under all the subjects of the Longobard kingdom, had become Longobards. That is to say, they had adopted the some had been kind of serfs and they had been freed eventually, or etc. Even think about marriages, banally, were Longobard men, surely since the very first beginning, say married, at least because that was the legal thing. Obviously many rapes, as you can imagine as well, but they had married Roman women, and obviously their children were Longobards, legally speaking. So the idea is that at this point in Longobard Italy, you don't hear much of Romans, because simply nobody was Roman anymore under the law. And naturally there was serfdom and slavery, even, like, if you were, like in Roman law, actually, if you contracted debts, if you killed someone, if you were a criminal, etc., you were sold like a slave, and that's something, it was present like everywhere. It was the norm at the time. So there were these kind of slaves, but it seems now that the absence of any news whatsoever about the Roman practice, that it was really not convenient for anyone to be a Roman now. It was way more convenient to be a Longobard for many reasons. And that example of Byzantine population fleeing into Longobard territory tells you exactly this, because those who had taken just like slaves, because they were Romans and caught by the Longobard, it's not realistic. Actually, the Longobards played much in this because they wanted really into the peninsula to present a model that could be attractive for captivating the population and passing from their side. So in fact there were many regions of frontier throughout all the peninsula that basically turned from Roman to Longobard over time. There was not even a real a military conquest proper at one point when one community turned out to be Longobard proper, right? This is particularly important. So going back to the Gastals, what the subject could do is to claim, to make a request for justice, and the case was presented to the Gastal, that obviously was someone who already knew the law and could, look at whether this demand was kind of good or not. And this meant that the cause could be sent directly to the king in Pavia. The Longobard kings were kind of literate, that they practiced, they were judges, they knew how the law worked. This is something completely different from the Franks, for example, that didn't give a damn. There's no literacy. That was all about war, private clienteles, military regimes. Longobards really built a administrative, judicial net, right? That works. That works because we have the documents that show us how these trials were carried out, and it was something very, even procedurally speaking, it was very complex and effective. Because, by the way, we are very lucky to have the Edict of Rotari, so that is the Longobard law. In this sense, from a theoretical point of view, from the codex, from the law, how it's written, and how it was effectively applied. And that is dramatically interesting, because it really shows you that not only this law was pretty much intelligent, but it actually worked. And the Longobard law lasted like for hundreds of years, even after the fall of the Longobard kingdom, because it was extremely effective. And the same recovery of the Roman law in the 10th century actually passed through the Longobardist jurists of northern Italy, that were those ones that at that time were usually dealing with Longobard law, even with feudal law that obviously had entered into the system, etc., but that they rediscovered Roman law exactly because what they were trying to fix now, according to the new social evolution, etc., let's say the gaps left naturally by Longobard law of several centuries before. So this is extremely important even for the history of European right and law, and it's and juridical development is particularly important. And the kings had, in this sense, a great. Nobody could say no. The king is not meant to judge. There was always some duke, because the king at that point as the king, in fact, could enforce law on the ducal territory. So you understand that this is a great challenge towards ducal power, but at the same time there was no ground for these dukes to oppose themselves to the king anymore. They didn't have any, I mean, at least more evident benefit from doing such a thing, and their power was progressively eroded because this juridical system worked excessively well, and all the subjects started looking at the monarchy upon, like, up to the monarchy, saying, wow, this thing works, it's effective, and we know that theoretically, actually, and even practically many times, every single subject of the Longobard kingdom could appeal himself to the king. And it was done. It was done because the Longobards were still thinking it the old fashion, like the Germanic way, that, I'm a freeman and I need I deserve justice by law. And the king is there exactly for this. So the Longobard king was fulfilling the traditional role of the king, that in that sense was a strongly ethnic role. It really embodied the Longobard ideal and identity, but at the same time it was bringing it further to develop something that was up to the point unknown to let's say to Longobard culture and society. That is, a monarchy was expanding pretty fast and becoming increasingly more powerful. And I can't stress enough how the Longobard kingdom from this point of view was the most civilly advanced in any other Romano-Germanic kingdom. There was no other Romano-Germanic kingdom that is in this time developed anything closest to this model of public efficiency and administrative complex and practice of written documents and the application of the law, right? This kind of public administration was particularly strong and would grow at least fairly strongly among the Anglo-Saxons, but much later. And this is an incredibly amazing feat because the Longobards' accomplishments were also looked upon with great admiration by peoples like the Franks, that, as we've seen, they had this incredibly rougher, much more privatized mindset that didn't know these forms of centralization, and they were quite interested in them, especially after the Carolingian conquest, when Charlemagne himself appointed himself king of the Longobards and maintained all the Longobard institutions standing, because he perfectly understood that those were dramatically helpful to administrate, to manage that kingdom. That was the most important, by the way, because of his all the reasons, the papacy, but also this greater strategical importance in Mediterranean, even against the Byzantines, because and they were exported elsewhere, like. The Carolingians drew pretty heavily, plenty hands from this system. And looking at Longobard society, there is also another figure that is difficult to frame. I wouldn't basically know how to define. We can call them pretty largely, broadly administrators, especially in the truest etymological meaning of the term, that are kind of more private figures, actually. There are the so-called Gazindi. So the Gazindi are fundamentally there are some people who have even here the older historiography wanted to see in these figures most like of a military referent of the king, like sort of private of magnate, of someone important who had his own military retinue, and through some private ties could side through the king and helping him and getting something reward, like appointments and offices and money and land, actually. So some scholars wanted to see back in the day a sort of similar sort of proto-vassalatic institution in this sense in the Longobard kingdom, looking at Gazindi chiefly as military figures, but this is really not accurate. At least, indeed, the Gazindi were related to even to military retinues and stuff like that. But military retinues, especially in terms of individual bodyguards, etc., were pretty widespread among the Longobard nobility. We have pretty much evidence of this. The Longobards, as we remember before, were extremely proud about their military character, because that was the symbol of manhood and freedom in the Germanic world. But the Gazindi were more than else kind of big client managers, let's say that had consistent control in certain parts of the population or the cities that people. So there were people who fluidified really the administration, and it is somewhat true. I have been discussing this sometimes even with some of the greatest Longobard history experts out there, and in their opinion sometimes saying, well, this is substantially different from the vassalic beneficiary system. Indeed it is, because that was based on completely different basis. I never really advocated for this, but the idea is that towards the end of the Longobard kingdom, there was this tendency to a sort of the growing of synesis, of strengths into the kingdom. And sometimes the kings were starting to have relative troubles to contain proper, so that these individuals were sometimes key figures to control these large chunks of fairly relatively large chunks, as we said before with the comparison of with the Franks. These weren't really aristocrats with large military retinues that were so powerful, and nothing like that, nothing like in the vassalic system, but they could help controlling the situation, right, privately. So even if the situation is very different, the tendency, at least, towards privatization is evident. But this belongs chiefly to the second half, to the 8th century, let's say, ideally then, and we will not arrive to today. We stop to the second half of to half of the 7th century. So another dramatically important figure, actually the second most important king after Liutprand in Longobard history, is Rotari, right? So Rotari was king of the Longobards between 636 and 652. He was Duke of Brescia. He was elected, so he was from the Neustrian milieu. That was generally the one preferred. I mean, by so more kings kind of raising, brought to the throne from there, and he was a kind of a fairly typical Longobard king in terms of functions. He had even this military character. He conquered Liguria, for instance. The Ligurian region was in the Byzantine hands, like most of coastal Italian coastal regions at this time. From 600, and the conquest was completed in 640. Liguria was important because it was fairly close to the center of the Longobard kingdom, and it opened it to the sea, right? So we know that at this point, even the Longobard kingdom at one point it incorporates Corsica as well. We don't have any explicit news of a military expedition, of the military conquest proper, but we can think that the island was absorbed partly into the Longobard trade and market in general, and Rotari also fought pretty bitterly into the Po Valley against the Byzantines. There is the Battle of the Skoltemna River, in which the Byzantines suffer a pretty bloody defeat that the Longobards do not quite exploit strategically, because seemingly they also suffered their own losses. But from that time on, basically the Byzantines give up, right? And they pass on the defensive, right? This is the general tendency that the Byzantines try to strike the Longobards back once again into beginning of 7th century. There are other incursions. There is the expedition of Constans II, but the general trend is that now the Longobards have the initiative, the Byzantines remain in their own territories because they don't have, there isn't really a structural exhaustion, even the local resources, so the Longobards progressively now start to erode all the Byzantine territory. If the Carolingians had not arrived to stop the process, basically Longobards would have seized the whole peninsular Italy by the end of the 8th century. At that point, because the Byzantine presence had basically evaporated. Basically, at least some centers had grown so similar to the Longobards, there was no point even in defending there. Even the Exarchate that we discussed. I made a video of Byzantine Italy, by the way, recently, so you can search for that into Byzantine history playlist. Tells you how it was the situation from the other side. That is also important because Byzantine Italy, yeah, people talk about that. It's not that we have on Schwerpunkt, we have disproportionately talked about Longobard Italy, but that's interesting as well. So, however, Rotari in this sense achieves now this further consolidation of the kingdom and organizes it further, right? And his main achievement, that is a very big achievement in the history of Europe, of the Middle Ages, of Western civilization, is the ability to have written down the ancient laws and customs of the Longobard people. In other words, to write this book of law, modifying the original Longobard laws, obviously given the new needs and times, so that there's a lot of discussion, and we'll see why about this, because up to that time the Longobard laws that existed, but they were transmitted orally, so nobody had written them down still, or at least hadn't systematically collected them and organized them in a book, right? Collected them in a book. So this achievement was very it's really remarkable for the times and spaces, right? And there were naturally big problems. Like now, the Longobard kingdom had its pretty marked territorial dimension, right? So the kingdom had its own center, its own administrative system, its political as well as military power. It also had its international prestige. The Longobards had really created something pretty big. Now, they couldn't remain like that. It had to be enhanced further. And a big problem up to that point was the exercise of justice, that we see, the enforcement of justice, and that we have seen before, was particularly important even for the same monarchy to be a point of reference for the world subjects and centralizing further its power. Now, the main problem at that point is that we don't, first of all, we don't know how the Longobard laws had changed. I mean, we obviously have this enormous luck to have a full edict written in Latin with all these with hundreds and hundreds of laws and dispositions. That is the most complete evidence of a Germanic law ever. I mean, everybody who studies Germanistics know that, you can't do without the Edict of Rotari, because you can't, that's the most complete Germanic juridical work that is being preserved, right? There is a problem, though, is that we don't see how, what's before. Obviously, the written stuff remained, but how did the Longobards really achieve that, how it was organized, how they thought it? It's partly something you can't see, but also that you don't really know the story behind the text, right? So, and the main problem is, naturally, and the most evident, is passing from an oral to a written tradition, which is complicated. Because you can't imagine what the differences were. Like, even, oral transmission is subjected to change, of course. Obviously, at the time, the oral transmission was pretty effective, actually. I mean, it's amazing what human mind can do in terms of memorizing. Now we are absolutely incapable of doing it anymore, but simply because we're not trained. Actually, during the Middle Ages, people, I mean priests actually, clerics, knew the Bible by heart. I challenge you to know the Bible by heart at the time, but at the time it was, I mean now, but at the time it was kind of feasible. There was, most of the people couldn't read, of course, but that's what oral tradition came into play. So and everything, what is difficult for our minds, modern mindset, is to conceive what for a Germanic mind the whole thing really was. Like, because the myth of the origins, for example, is inserted into this edict. So the Longobards remained thought about their history, their religion, their law as basically as a unicum. So this is amazing, and yet it's still not everything, because by the year that this was done, which was 643, you can imagine that even the oral tradition had somewhat modified itself. That obviously partly this had already been written down in some form that we don't know really much about, but now we are in the basically in the third generation at the latest from the Longobard invasion of the peninsula. So the Longobards at this point are quite difficultly even distinguishable from the rest of the Italic population. They have mixed, they have acquired partly also their tongue, because these people hardly spoke Germanic anymore, at least as their first language, and obviously they had a very strong still Germanic mindset in many ways, but obviously they had mixed with the Latin element. In fact, in the same edict, which is written obviously in Latin, you find so many Germanic terms that were actually transliterated into Latin, but they were still Germanic. So it's pretty fascinating actually to read, also because Longobard as a language is beautiful, by the way, and it has also, obviously we don't know excessively much about it, but thanks to this edict as well, we know. By the way, in modern Italian, there's plenty of words, actually, pretty consistent amount, actually, derived from the Longobard. The minds had changed. So what was written down in 643 is something mediated by basically almost 80 years of sedentarization, of cultural blending with other traditions, etc., of a monarchical direction, and obviously is writing this edict in a fashion that is also referential to the monarchy, because the monarchs are remembered into the tradition, etc. We think that in here was a kind of a further ideological let's say expansion of the monarchy, in terms of showing that the monarchs had always kind of been there. We said before how the Longobards were relatively had a relatively difficult relation with the concept of monarchy, or at least in their origin. By the way, this is what really characterizes the Longobards the most, and that's why they had actually an elective monarchy, is that they felt themselves as a people. Their myth of the origin is a people myth. It's not about kings, it's about people, of men and women. This is also extraordinary. That's hence the importance of women in Longobard law is very important. There's a lot of we'll see it later. But so you can imagine that the edict is a product of many factors that do not show us what the real Germanic law was about, originally speaking. So there is a huge debate about this, and for reasons that frankly I don't even think they're important to discuss at a certain point, but because much of it is ideological. I would only say that there is an incredibly amount of false interpretation of Germanic law around that basically is a kind of a progressivist rape of history for saying that basically that actually conceals a kind of a proto-racist actual interpretation of the stories, that basically the all we have from Germanic law is mediated through Christian culture, and therefore is somewhat it's different from the origins, according to which women were kind of equal to men. It's all bullshit, to make long story short. These weren't at all egalitarian. This is a flipping of words. It even works on semantics. People confuse things like the egalitarianism of the Germanic peoples that derived essentially from their primitive social organization, the lack of resources, general poverty, to a kind of true egalitarian mindset on the base of things, even like distinctions of the sexes. It's absolutely not the case. Woman was absolutely not equal to men. They didn't even have women had in Germanic law a juridical autonomy. They were considered as juridical personas, actually, but they excuse me, they weren't absolutely equal. They always had a sort of protector that had to speak for them, to defend them legally, and to represent them legally. So it's way different than kind of white supremacist stuff to see here out there, to pretend that this populations of the North were somehow morally superior for some reason that we can't sympathize with today. It's not like that, and it's shameful, unfortunately, how this information is spread out there, because other people fundamentally know nothing about this work. Actually, I had the luck and privilege to say, let's say, to actually read and study in part the Edict, and I've read it all actually, and I studied it. I chiefly studied things about public order. Incidentally, it was interesting because it was some of the closest things got to military affairs. That actually there are military dispositions as well, but there are also other laws that were an addition. Because, by the way, this Edict is it was written by Rotari, but then the tradition was, it was normal actually that every king could add new laws, because this is Germanic juridical institutions were quite simple. It was like a list of laws. It was not like in Roman laws that there is a complex juridical thinking with all the various categories and institutions. The Germanic law is simpler. And in fact, I'm disgusted sometimes to hear things like, it's just Germanics, like, this law is so simple, it's so stupid, it must have been so primitive. This is nonsense as well. This is complete and utter rubbish. For that world, this was an extremely advanced edict, an extremely advanced and complex and intelligent juridical work. This thing worked. We got it from the documents. It was extremely flexible, extremely effective, it really looked at society to solve the problem. Many edicts and stuff like that, they're even in other countries, they're kind of bombastic and they say things like just maybe to stress the ideological power of kings enough, and regulate a sort of self-assertion of kingship, chiefly over the aristocracy. This thing is a wholly different thing. This speaks literally to the people. It's an edict that is working for the average subject, for solving problems effectively, practically, pragmatically speaking. There is an astonishing pragmatism into the Longobard Edict that it's difficult to assess if you don't read it, if you don't study about it. But it's sometimes it's even funny because it says things, we could spend, maybe I will make a video about the Edict of Rotary, all the funny dispositions it says, but they're still actually, they can't sound funny, but if you look in detail and try to understand what it's really meaning, why that law was inserted there, you realize that actually it was a pretty valid reason. And maybe you're even lucky enough to have documents of trials and other stuff that prove you that that was the case. So the Edict of Rotari is of enormous importance because of this. First of all, the history of Germanic law, but also because it shows us in fair detail about the social, economical, and cultural history of the Longobard people in this moment, like in the mid of the 7th century. This is fairly early in time, right? So we get progressively other laws episodically being produced, especially in the 8th century, where things were getting a bit politically and socially more complex, so that was required. But 643 is what is supposed to be kind of the darkest hour of the early Middle Ages, and you see that, you read that, and you look at this world and say, wow, these people were, living a life out there. It was dynamic. There was some. It really astonishes you. It really makes you understand how, in this, even if we know very few about those times, still, when you look at them a bit more in detail, when you have the lack of having this surviving material, you discover a world you wouldn't imagine, at least given the amount of stereotypes and fairy tales that is told to us about the Middle Ages and their alleged darkness and all these, in fact, fairy tales. Then there is no other way to put it. So the dispositions of the Edict make reference to several aspects of daily life, even of Longobard people, and there are of the Longobard people. I mean, at this point, the Longobard subjects, really, as we were saying before. So there are mainly questions related to like judiciary procedures, civil right, actual criminal, civil law, criminal law, and administrative law, right? So there are extremely important and interesting information that you can derive on society and economy. An economy that naturally at this point is based chiefly on cattle. The Longobards definitely got kind of Romanized in their settlement, but they also brought many traditions from the north. They brought their cattle it was very important, because especially when with the agricultural contraction of the early Middle Ages, you see that husbandry and all this stuff kinds of other importance. For instance, pigs are dramatically important in the Edict of Rotary. The pork's guardians were people who even had an individual price. Every man had a value in life, in his as a person. They were much more important, because in fact this grazing and even woods and fishing, etc., were primary important. And it seems actually that as it happens in other regions of Europe, this early medieval population had a diet which far richer in proteins and fats, because of these forms of land exploitation, than lower medieval people that were usually salaried workers or peasants that worked, just eating, grain, like bread and stuff like that. So pretty worse. This doesn't mean, however, that early medieval life was this paradisiac actually, but it was still not even that bad thing. We were sometimes thought to, we are presented with some interpretations, and as we were saying, forests were quite important, and also the gathering, the non-cultivated, the non here, what the hell, this damn thing doesn't work, excuse me, technical problems, like uncultivated fallow land was particularly important, even for the nature cycles and gathering and all this stuff. So it's a widely rural world, especially the first edict. So the edict in itself, I mean, without the further additions, is strictly a rural world. In the 8th century, when you read the additions to the edict from the other kings, you see that there isn't much more about trade, because economy was reviving, especially in the Po Valley. It was pretty dynamic and getting an important international trade way. It was trade route, so it was particularly involved even in this commercial activities. But there is also the discipline to, say, the edict intervenes to modify certain important cornerstones of the Germanic customary law, right? First of all, and this is particularly important because I looked at it, especially looking at public order, is the feud, right? Now, the feud was actually a pretty effective Germanic institution, juridical institution, when these populations lived out there in a kind of semi-nomadic world, and everything was very dynamic. There was no time for complex problems. So the idea is that if I killed someone of your family, you can kill by right a person of my own family. The less bloody solution was to pay actually a certain amount of money for the dead person, because, as we were saying before, at this time every person had a price, right? The Wertgeld, the value of the worth of the person, of the money that could be equated. That can sound pretty dark to us. I mean, how can you give a price to human life? Sadly enough, human life had and still has actually a monetary, a quantifiable price. They were quite pragmatic, as we were saying, and therefore the idea in this is that these societies were fairly way more, they accepted this kind of settlement, right? So they had as long as they lived out there in Central Europe, this thing kind of worked. When this, you settled down, you tried to organize something more socially complex, etc. The right of feud is something that kind of complicates the story, right? Because society is not that simple as that anymore. It can have broader implications, larger affiliation. So the real problem is that there was some way to compensate this. And what happens in the edict, actually I already said it, is that there is a money that is introduced, the Wertgeld, to refund every kind of damage that was inflicted. Actually, this isn't just, the feud could consist in everything. Maybe you stole someone's cows, let's say, and he wanted to be paid back. So now the Longobard kings realized that the feud, how it was originally thought in this kind of sense of honor, etc., when the person really had to go there and kill the other one physically, was something too brutal for kind of a sedentary and civilly organized environment. So, and this is particularly important because there was a great emphasis from in the edict to eradicate this bloody custom of really, perpetrating the feud bloodily. And this obviously was appeared to be socially disruptive, but at the same time it was so deeply rooted into the Germanic tradition that nobody really seemed to give up. For instance, there is an equal, let's say a similar problem, at least in the 8th century, when King Liutprand issues, actually he makes an addition by saying that now he was adding other laws and said now that he says, pluralis majestatis, says we are worried fundamentally that for the judicial duels, that was also a typical tradition of the Longobard people, the Germanic peoples, and the same king says, we could forbid judicial duels because many of our subjects, because this was the problem, because there were the same subjects that were asking for these things to stop, because evidently they had received a pretty, a big damage from this, because judicial duel basically means is that if you cannot prove things otherwise, you can't solve the matter in a duel. And obviously there is no justice into this, because the idea is that the gods, at least initially speaking, and God now, were called to the judgment, like saying, the winner, it's because God made him win, essentially. But it's evidently unfair. And Liutprand, that was actually one of the most Catholic kings at that point, he was named like this, said, we obviously realize that that's bad, but you know what, that this custom is so deeply rooted in our people that even issuing it, to forbid it would be ineffective. So unfortunately, he says, we can't do anything about it. And that's pretty interesting, and tells you so much even about the mindset of these people, that evidently. And what is interesting is that at the time of Liutprand, now these were all, seriously, they were kind of all Italians, right? There wasn't the Longobard anymore. They believed themselves to be all Longobards because that was their name, that was their identity. But we're talking about even the Latin population that had been so deeply Germanized by this Longobard model, that had been dramatically functional to this middle and small class property owners that absolutely had fled the large senatorial estate model of land exploitation and work exploitation of the Roman times. Now they did this like judicial duel, as if they had always been Longobards back in the generations, right? And this is extraordinary, in my opinion. And the monarchy pushes for stemming at least this violent behaviors, because they are violent behaviors, the people being killed. So the vertical is particularly meaningful, because that really tells you is that do not kill each other, just pay a sum, right? And it's kind of difficult, because by the way, if you kill someone, you may say, well, life didn't cost much at the time objectively, but does money really compensate, the loss of a beloved one that's being killed unfairly? So this poses even deeper philosophical problems that, however, probably, for us it seems relatively jarring to reason in the way they did, but probably in their mindset it was really functioning like this, that it was considered fair to receive money for even, as a compensation, even from assassinations, as killings, right? Kind of, and settling the whole matter, because the idea was that this was not really a punishment, because in the Germanic mindset, society had to work basically by itself. This was the general idea, that there was no king initially, and the king now had been appointed just like a sort of broader, say, military leader / administrator. But the idea is that you don't have to pay money as a punishment. You basically pay money as a compensation, because the punishments was something said very different, that the Longobards actually introduced even in their edict as a sort of form of humiliation. For instance, being whipped for committing particularly heinous crimes. Being whipped for a Germanic freeman was probably one of the greatest insult, because whipping is something you do with slaves, right? So that meant that your crime was so disgusting, fundamentally, even socially detrimental, etc., that you were degraded to that point. In fact, some of them even lost their freedom by law. This could be done. So that's also important, because, for instance, you notice the rise of these dispositions that, in an original Germanic context would have not been possible to do, because the people would have said, who is the king to impose us these measures that are not part of our Germanic customary law? And obviously, it's not that before things worked that better or that fairer at all. It was probably a much more violent world, as this, insistence for making feuds ceasing actually proves at the end of the story, at the end of the day. Sorry, but it's still very, very cool to get these shades of, right? Because that's what the feud was. You know, you had killed one of my family, well, I will kill one of your family, and we are done. Theoretically. Then the truth was evidently that the feud went on. That's really what the problem was, because, you know, we're not machines. Hatred, enmity remains even after this compensation, right? And the and there are other very important details about Longobard society at this time that prove a definite transformation in this sense. For example, by the way, there was a social ranking of the various subjects. I mean, not all subjects were the same. There was a sort of mix of patrimonial and, in general, reputation criterion to say that basically one person was more worthy than another. That is to say, you know, there were noble people even in this kind of relatively, you know, everybody was a freeman in terms of who was a Longobard, at least. Then there were even the serfs and the slaves proper. But there were certain freemen that were freer than others. So it's very Orwellian as a statement. But it is really so. Obviously, think about those ducal families and their entourage and all that stuff. So that's pretty obvious. So this entailed that in that case, the Wertgeld, so the individual price of the factor of the single person was higher. Sometimes could be much higher, actually. So this is fairly unjust, as you imagine, and it already shows that society is changing, is stratifying, especially, which is typical of sedentary societies that evidently are, you know, in Longobard society was much more egalitarian than before, and that's kind of a regular, much less egalitarian than before, and this is kind of a regular trend that you see in all the other Romano-Germanic peoples that arrive from Central Europe, Northern Europe, wherever they came from this fairly primitive and poor and kind of depressed areas, and they had this relatively, you know, egalitarian system because everybody was theoretically equally poor, right? They fought. The only way to have more money was to raid and to fight, and that's why they were so warlike in character. So when they settled down into these former provinces of the Roman Empire that instead are lands of, you know, now of plurisecular sedentarization and agricultural system, etc., they evidently you know, have different stories. Some make more money, the others some less, and worryingly enough, some of them start to oppress others, right? So, in fact, in the same edict, what you read is that there are the pauperes, as they're called in Latin, that is the poor, basically, the defenseless, for which the Rotarian codification extends the king's protection to. That is to say, basically, the poor, that here are not meant really as just the poor people in general, but chiefly the defenseless, like widows or orphans. So these categories that are, you know, historically, I mean, in every society, especially also in the Christian one or the Roman one, have this great, but also in the Germanic one, you know, they belong, they're protected by the entire society. So from the public authority, because they're the weaker one, they have no one who helps them. The woman now, as we will see, needed a protector in the Longobard law. Well, if there was no other male around, that was the one that by law, by, you know, parental ties had to obtain the mundum of the woman, the protector, the woman, or the orphan, became the king, which is kind of a fair thing to do. It's also in here a kind of a political move to say, to to make subjects looking up to the king with respect and hope, and and that he would protect them. And this is not really very rhetorical, because say early medieval society was fairly simple to render this relatively possible, actually. And this the king, as we have seen, could really hear anyone, right? You could literally go at the king's palace and to have an audience if you were obviously in search of justice, right? And so when we look at women, finally, in this side of the story, I stressed before that their importance in Longobard society was great, but that at the same time their juridical condition was weak, right? So you never have to exchange the importance in the Germanic world broadly meant, right? So the Edict of Rotari, I remember it, is particularly important because it tells us the most than any other Germanic law about Germanic laws, actually, of all epochs, right? And it's interesting because lots of what is told even by the Romans that were observing the Germans many centuries before is what you find in Rotari's Edict, right? So it's particularly fitting. There is all beautiful, if you want to read a very beautiful book about this, there is Barbarian Europe, the Europe of the Barbarians by Modzelewski, if you have the time, and it's a beautiful book, one of the most beautiful read that I ever made. Is that, importance doesn't equate to freedom. Actually, women were considered as this extremely important member of society because, Longobards are warriors. You take a very good, strong, virtuous woman to generate a true warrior. I mean, true warriors are not born out of individuals that are not important. So that was the important how it was seen. But let's say this resource, how badly as it can sound to define women, was so important, it was treasured, and in this sense sheltered and protected, and at the end of the day controlled, legally speaking. So basically, how did it work? So every woman had a mundium. Now, the mundium is a very interesting Germanic institution for which basically every woman has a certain amount of money that basically is a bit like the Wertgeld, that is basically the price of the woman in this case, but not quite, because it's basically the money that she can dispose of. And at least theoretically, in the sense that the depository of the mundium was the head of the family. That was obviously patrilinear. So it was like a sort of dowry. So when the woman left the family of the father for marrying, she was given this mundium to bring with her, to even being sort of autonomous, even in eventually for if she remained a widow, for example. Theoretically, this mundium passed to someone else. In that case of the marriage, it passed to the I don't actually remember what it was, to remain actually to the father or to the husband. I think it remained to the husband. But the interesting thing about this is that in the Germanic law there was a sort of counter dowry in the case of marriage, that it was the man paying. It was the Morgengabe, that is the gift of the day after the marriage, technically, and it was sometimes even larger than the dowry, right? And this was really to make the exchange fair in some sense, because the woman brought with her the mundium, so there had to be a sort of counterpart from the male side. So now I'm not an expert actually specifically about this, so I may say something slightly imprecise, but that's the concept basically. And essentially, in fact, the mundium is just the ransom that was there was to be paid in order to demand the woman as a bride, right? Just like in other Germanic laws, women couldn't claim any right on the inheritance. By the way, I forgot to say, if you're interested in the Mundium, because that's a pretty big institution. Mund actually means protection, so that was the idea of the Mundium in itself, is this kind of security, this value attached to the woman, but for the woman to be, to dispose of the woman for the sake of her own protection. So that was it was in part even a sort of inheritance. That's why I was telling about it now, because that was conceptually how it went, right? It was a bit of a myth between a dowry and an inheritance, some sort. And there was, however, a further disposal. There was the meta that the woman had actually on the dowry proper. There was a dowry as well for the marriage, so that passed together with the Mundium. I believe that it was the only property that she could completely dispose of for free, right? So this was naturally a smaller amount, but that was what she was entitled to. And however, the Longobard Edict has this constant reference to the idea that women had to be safeguarded, that they always had to have a protector, they had to be legally represented, because if you owned the woman's Mundium, you were legally responsible for her, and you had to speak for her in court, in legal affairs. So that was particularly important. And however, this very strong protection is something that mostly derived from the Germanic background. But you see that in Italy, the more times go on and more women acquire de facto more power, there is a lot of documents, a lot of contracts and especially also testaments actually from the 8th century that basically tell you that women did dispose even of pretty solid properties, not as really as owners, but that de facto enjoyed them as if they were, right? So that legally speaking, there still was someone who controlled them. Even the idea that at a certain point the Mundium passed to the king, for instance, that if she had no male protectors, it kind of tells you how this could be, how solutions could be relatively vague and adaptable and flexible. So this was interesting to at least to observe, and we might actually the history of Longobard women is particularly fascinating. Maybe we will get a bit more in detail on it in some other video, but I hope you're interested. But yeah, if you want to read more and know more, just read about these things. Also in other Germanic laws, but definitely in Rotari's Edict you find lots of this stuff. It's pretty interesting. Okay. So, pretty long video, but we made it. We'll keep talking about Longobard history. Don't think it's over. This is just the beginning, probably. I hope that for now you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like. Otherwise, I don't remember. Otherwise, subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.